From the city of broad shoulders, this is Chicago Unscripted with CBS News Chicago's Joe Donlan.
Joel, thank you so much for the time. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me, Joe.
It's great to have you. These are some heavy and important topics, and you're a great person to address them. How do you describe yourself, Joel? A peace broker, a peace strategist, a pursuer of peace? What would you say?
That's very kind of you. I think I'd say that I'm a public policy entrepreneur, where I try in the public space to, like an entrepreneur, try and solve difficult problems. But unlike the private sector, you're not trying to maximize shareholder value as much as try and do as much good as possible while upsetting the least amount of people. I've chosen to do it in the foreign policy space, and I've had a very lucky career, and I find myself working trying to help people who sometimes have diplomatic relations, sometimes don't, try and find ways that they can work better together.
Yeah. You've been in Chicago since 2014. You and I talked the other day, and you pointed out the importance of many of these issues we're about to discuss here in Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago is a unique place. Despite my accent, I'm a delighted Chicagoan. I'm a CPS parent. My daughter was born in Prentice. I moved just before the Cubs won the World Series, so I cheated on that. But I was there for all the Bears sadness before we got Caleb, so that was also fun. But Chicago is sort of between the 10th and 12th largest Jewish city in the world, and it also happens to be the largest city of Palestinians outside of Chile in the entire outside the Middle East. So the Chicago and Chicagoland has real significant diaspora cares about what happens between Israelis and Palestinians. And just generally as a global city, I think that we often think of foreign policy as completely distinct from our domestic politics. But if the past few years have taught us anything, there are people who are very passionate about what happens over there. And we really have an obligation to center those who are being harmed by this conflict in our discourse.
I'd like to start with some foundational big picture questions and observations from you before we get into some of the things that are actually happening around the world today. You've spent much of your adult life working on this. You led the Alliance for Middle East Peace for many years. You've been part of fundraising efforts that authorized, as I understand it, more than $250 million in new funding for peace building. So to use a metaphor, if this work is a marathon, and that's probably an accurate description, what mile do you think we're on?
I think we've hit collapse, which normally would sound like, oh God, it's all failed. But I think that as any marathon runner tells you, that there's a point in the marathon where you feel like you're going to die. And then afterwards you push through and you go through the wall. In many ways, we've been moving towards a collapse for a very long time. As you mentioned, my work at the Alliance for Middle East Peace, I helped lead a bipartisan effort through Congress that created the Nita Emloe Middle East Partnership for Peace Act that truly tried to put our values and invest in peace builders between Israelis and Palestinians, both in a civic and economic sense. I think that a misnomer in the conflict had always been that this had been a very over-resourced community. But if you looked at it compared to, for example, Northern Ireland, we invested just a fraction per capita in Israel-Palestine on peace versus what we're investing in the machinery of war or just direct humanitarian aid. And so it was really trying to make sure that if you want the grassroots to grow, you need to give them soil and sunlight. And so the soil could be the funding and the sunlight was the attention. So how do you move it from being nice to necessary? And so for the part of my career before my current job, I did a lot of grassroots work, trying to make sure that they weren't just nice, but necessary, and that they could build the necessary requirements with the legitimate funding that each side could trust in order to do that. But I think that any true assumption is when you look at the youth in Israel and amongst Palestinians are the most pessimistic and in many ways the most right-wing of their constituencies. And that's both because they've become more religious and because of their lived experience of just failure. So I think that policymakers need to understand that hope is not a strategy. And how can we make sure that for the next generation, we take them for where they are today rather than where we hope that they would be from before? And that's a complicated situation.
It sure is. And you bring up the youth. You have children yourself. I think a lot about the younger generation, Joel, watching this and probably asking just a pragmatic question like, why is this happening? What do these countries want? How would you answer that?
It's a complicated situation, but in many ways, you've got it depends on what part of the region you look at. But if you're just looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or depending on what terminology you use, occupation, from the Israeli sense, there's a very large region out there and they feel very small. And they're like, we just want to be accepted for who we are and that we are part of the region. And the rest of the region and much of the world says to them, if you want to live, you need to demonstrate you can live at peace with the Palestinians rather than just try and dominate them. And the inability for the sides to even be able to see each other, not just as people, but within the frames of reference that you're using, that gap in understanding is what's driving so much of this. And the even though there's an asymmetry of power, one side is clearly more powerful than the other, there is a symmetry of fear and mistrust. And how we break through that symmetry of fear and mistrust is an essential element. And it's not just a side gig. And I'd also say that when you push out to the wider region, from where you sit is from where you see. Like if you're sitting in Tehran, you see a very different region than if you're sitting in Ankara, or if you're sitting in Jerusalem, or if you're sitting in Ramallah. And the ability to be able to put yourselves in the eyes of someone else, to be able to understand why it is that they see the region differently from you is critical. And the last thing that I'll say, Joe, is I think that in our today's society, we often think that we can pressure other people to come to an agreement with us. That if we just push them enough, if we just protest them enough, or if we apply military pressure enough, they're going to come round, they'll give up, they'll surrender, we'll break them. And the reality is that if someone thinks you're trying to break them or you're trying to shatter them, they're going to resist with everything they've got. And they're going to, even if you do break them, they're going to bequeath that hate and that humiliation to their children and their children's children. And so trying to find a place where you can convince or persuade someone without trying to break them is difficult, but necessary if we're going to move beyond some of these very difficult, long-standing hatreds.
Yeah, it becomes a cycle, right?
It becomes a cycle, but we also shouldn't get lost in the concept that these are ancient hatreds that go back millennia. It's just not true, right? If we're just looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is a national conflict that goes back to sort of the early part of the 20th century. There have become religious flavors on it, and we do need to take the faith element seriously. But these aren't ancient hatreds that can never be overcome and that we're doomed to murder each other as we move forward. There are political abilities to overcome. And Joe, I know that we're in a moment of huge escalation, but if we go back to sort of the end of the 90s, we saw the fall of apartheid South Africa, we saw the Northern Irish conflict dealt with, we saw Yugoslavia and sort of what happened in the Baltics. There was a moment, and we saw the Oslo Accords, at least in the region, that was this hope that we could move forward. And we can't lose sight of the fact that there was optimism, there was hope, there was a peace dividend at one point. It doesn't need to be doomed for this escalation. So I think that it's very easy when you're speaking to young people, when all they've seen is a Middle East at war with each other, that's all it could be. But the region really is trying to move beyond that and move into a more stable, integrated space. And how we as Americans can help that is really the order of the day.
Yeah, we'll get to some of these questions because I do have them down the road here for our conversation. But you touched on the idea of pressure, and it reminded me of your TED Talk from a couple of years ago. And it holds up very well today, Joel, because as you said, pressure doesn't work. People only dig in harder. They're not looking to change people's minds. They're looking to break them. And then the other thing that stood out to me was when you said we're all trying to shatter each other on everything all the time. Most problems, you say, are solved by people changing their position. So the question is, how do you do that?
It's very difficult. And in order to do that, number one, you need to understand that your job, if you want to convince someone to move, is to enable them to have a safe space, not a safe space, but a safe landing zone that they can move into. Like if they change their position, will they be humiliated by that change? So I'll give a very banal example that I used in the TED Talk, right? So, and we're on a Chicago podcast. So like, if you were a huge Justin Fields truther, if you really thought that he was the best quarterback for the Bears, and you needed to be convinced that maybe he wasn't the answer. If someone comes to you and says, look, you never knew football in the first place and you were an idiot, you're going to probably dig in on your Fields opinion because you don't want to be humiliated. If someone said, look, he had all the potential in the world and it just didn't work out, and there's no shame in taking that pick, he's a great guy and we wish him the best luck, most people will be like, okay, I could get there. So in the same way, when you look at conflicts on any sort of situation, are you trying to get someone saying, look, I know you had a good point, and there might be some truth in what you were saying, but it's not sustainable for you to do that. Are we able to shift people's minds? Can you create the environment where you can understand where they're coming from and then try and say, I understand, but is there a way that we can disappoint you at a rate you can accept? Is there something, can we move you there? But I think that for many of us, we think that it's a moral imperative to just force the other. And the reason that's so seductive, Joe, is that pressure requires everything of you and nothing of me, right? If I'm right and you're wrong, and I just need to force you to see that, I don't need to move. And if I'm trying to convince you of something, often it might change something in myself, and that's very threatening. Because if you might have to move your opinion, it means you weren't right all along either. And I think that the way that we move people is to also be able to be moved ourselves. And that can be unmooring, quite literally.
Well, it seems important and not lost on anyone today, especially considering the political discourse in our country right now, that it is important to have an open mind. But people, it seems, are very reluctant to move at all, to your point, because it means giving up what they've always believed.
I mean, it requires a sense of self-belief and self-confidence that you can do that. I think that so much of our political discourse and so much of our attention span on social media has been so clipped that we're not having deep thinking about what do we really think and believe. Instead, we just sort of have placards like, I am a collection of bumper stickers. This is what I believe. And if you push on those bumper stickers, it can be kind of fragile. And that fragility is difficult because it can shatter you. And so I think it requires us being more confident about who we are as a more wholesome thing. And I think that everything in our society pushes against that because it's quick hits, it's an attention economy. Who can say something controversial? Then I'll agree with them. You know, there might be people even listening to this podcast and they're not really listening to what we're saying. They're just listening to what words we use. So they can categorize us very quickly. Like if I use the term occupation, I'm this person. If I use the term conflict, I'm that person. If I say peace too much, I'm this person. If I say freedom and rights too much, I'm that person. They're not really listening. They're just trying to categorize to work out before they've even started, am I on your side or am I not on your side? I think that we need to try and help people through having more depth and knowledge move beyond that. And it's not just about the Middle East or things that really inflame people's passions. On all of our politics, why do you believe this? What is the philosophy that underpins what you believe? Because when you expand that, there's more space to build a bigger tent.
I think that leads perfectly into the debate and division we're seeing within the U.S. What do you make of the tenor of the debate in the U.S. right now? The pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses last year, allegations of anti-Semitism, what's considered genocide, what's considered terrorism. These are all things that have been front and center in the U.S. It's become, I don't need to tell you, very divisive. So how does this impact the peace effort overall?
So the first thing to say is it really does. This concept that what we do doesn't matter, and I think that actually drives a lot of the frustration and fury of people. It actually does matter a lot. When people in the region see protests or they see what's said at protests, it creates an image for them of what the political reality is, especially here in the States, and it pushes them in some ways one way or another. So I think that the first thing is to understand that people do have a role, but I think people are deeply frustrated because they feel that they lack control. And when you lack control, you sort of lash out, especially as you've seen things that can be deeply disturbing. It's no surprise, Joe, that people are getting more and more agitated and passionate, because just think about what we've been seeing on social media. We've been seeing pictures and videos of horrendous levels of death and destruction and violence and inhumanity. And that has a psychological effect on us. There's a reason, traditionally, you're a news broadcaster, you don't show gruesome images in the daily news, or you give warnings to that so that people aren't seeing that. But when you're on social media, when you're on Instagram or TikTok, and you see these things burn into your eyeballs, no matter what your age is, it doesn't matter if you're 65, by the way, or if you're 14, these have deep psychological scars on you. And then if you've sided one way or the other, if you've watched all of the footage of October 7th and you've seen the horrendous massacres that were going on by Hamas, or conversely, if you've watched the Israeli reprisals and the horrendous stuff that happened in Gaza and the death and the destruction that happened there, For you to try and humanize the person who did that, or the entities that did that, or the people who support those who did the others, you associate them with the worst elements of what happened, because that's what's in your psychological brain. That's what's in your brain. That's what you're remembering. And your reaction is reacting to dead children, one way or the other. And so in many ways, it's truncating our ability to have a debate. And as you said, there are massive, big, huge issues that are lying behind this. Terrorism, anti-Semitism, lots of different things that each independently need to be unpacked in a very sensitive way. But how can we be that sensitive when we've been brutalized at the same time? So I try and be very forgiving to people who are very frustrated, because how could you not be? And at the same time, try and at least ask of our political leadership or our grass tops, sort of our community leaders, to show some leadership about how we can have these nuanced conversations. Because just riling people up more and more just basically imports conflicts into our society rather than sort of mirrors what we could potentially project outwards.
You know, you've touched on something that I've thought a lot about as I watch these same Instagram videos and TikToks that you mentioned. You've dedicated your life to work toward peace, but we see people crying on the streets and children in tears after the bombings. We've had Iran, mowing over thousands and potentially tens of thousands of their own people in the street. I just wonder, Joel, what happened to our humanity, right? The qualities of being kind, merciful, empathetic, sympathetic. What happened to us?
There are two real answers to that. The first is it's always been like this, and we've only just now got cameras. I think some people who live not in the West will say it's always been this brutal, you're just now seeing it, and that you're now being exposed to the reality of what force projection looks like, one way or the other. And so that's one potential answer. I don't know if I buy that completely, but I do think there is some truth that as we're more exposed to the realities that it's, you have wars live streamed by independents. I think that war is gruesome and messy and horrible, and there's a reason we try to avoid it. There's a reason that some of the best poetry and art and literature happens after a war by soldiers who fought in it, who write these poems about how we should never go back to do that. You can read all the literature after World War II and World War I around how that happens. I think the second argument, Joe, is I think that as we're moving beyond an America-dominated international liberal system, as we're moving beyond an America international liberal system, and we're going into a more of a multipolar world, it's messy, and people are trying to dominate the environment and the space in different ways in terms of how that is and how that looks. And what does that mean is that people are now using force to try and create different maps. And they say, look, it might be hard and it might be messy right now, but we're trying to create a better and a more synthesized region that will work for us. But as one power comes out, another one comes and fills its space. And I think the big challenge that when you say what's happened to us is, I think that on the ascendancy, not just in the Middle East, but across the world, is this concept that we need to take care of ourselves first before we even think about taking care of anyone else. If that means that I need to make you less comfortable or less safe to make me more safe and more comfortable, that's something that I think leaders who are being elected, in populist ways are being attractive. And I think that's because people in every society are feeling more and more alienated by the concept of a global good or a global commons. And they're really stuck in zero-sum games, that if something's good for you, it must be bad for me. And if it's good for me, it must be bad for you. And you know what? That's just how I have to live. I think that we, our world leaders and everyone else need to put it upon themselves that we need to try and rediscover where we can have global goods and where we can try and create more goods for everyone, more good outcomes for everyone if we find ways that we can have cooperative. And the sad thing, and I'll finish off with this, when we look at the big challenges of today, whether it's fighting global pandemics, climate change, whether we're looking at, competition over scarce resources, space exploration, whatever these things are, it requires common answers to a collective problem. And that requires some level of interdependency and an ability to work together. And so we're going to be forced to do this, because if we don't, we'll all sink together.
This may be too simplistic, but I feel like most people in the world just want to live in peace. Do you think that governments are letting their people down, I guess? And it reminds me of something I saw the other day, the horseshoe theory of politics, which I hadn't heard, but it's where the extreme sides are essentially at the top of the horseshoe next to each other. And then down at the bottom is this wide swath of people who are in the middle, if you will. And if there is to be success, that group is the key.
So I think, the horseshoe and everything else is sort of an intensity of preference. So what do I mean by that? You could have lots and lots and lots and lots of people agree on one thing, but they don't really care about it that much. They just care, like most people, about the schools their kids go to, the price of gas, everything else. But there's a small minority who care really a lot about this one thing, and their intensity of preference means that our elected officials take them very seriously, because they'll all come out and vote in a primary. They'll all make sure that they're the loudest, and then they often get their way. And so one thing is to say, look, more people need to care about more things. But in many ways, that also just exacerbates the problem. The other thing you've got, Joe, and it's a real problem in the Middle East, is that even if governments want to do the right thing, you've got extremists who are not government actors and often can be proxies for other people who operate in spaces where states should operate, and they run an independent foreign policy. So if you look in Lebanon, for example, you've got an entire armed militia called Hezbollah who are funded by the Iranians to sort of carry out Iranian foreign policy. And even if the army of Lebanon doesn't want to go to war with Israel, Hezbollah will fire rockets at Israel and try and force that, because they want to prevent something that the Iranians don't want to see. And so you also have challenges that you've got empty space where non-state actors are dictating international foreign policy rather than having states. And so I think one of the big systemic challenges moving forward, I think one of the lessons, at least that the Israelis learned after the 7th of October, was that you have to take non-state actors as seriously as state actors. And if the state that they're operating in can't control them, then someone else is going to need to, because you can't live in a liminal state, the state in between where these people have so much control and yet they're not legally responsible for the territory that they're in.
Right. Well, how does that impact the effort to try to build peace there?
Deeply. So you could look even going back into the 90s, where you had, even if when the Israelis and Palestinians were trying to move forward on the peace accords, you had other states who didn't want to see it move forward because they wanted to challenge regional dominance or primacy, funding extremist groups to disrupt it. You've seen that with Hamas, which is a US designated terrorist group that's based in Gaza and was in the West Bank. You've seen Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You've got Hezbollah to the north. You've got the Houthis in Yemen. There was an entire approach about using regional proxies as sort of frontline actors, so that any war you would fight, if the Iranians wanted to fight, they would fight through proxies and their enemies rather than on their home front. And what changed last year in the 12-day war, when President Trump sent the B-2 bombers, Operation Midnight Hammer, and sort of blew up and, as he said, obliterated the Iranian nuclear threat, you saw for the first time the Iranian home front really being attacked, and that sort of shocked the Iranians. And then you've seen in the current war with Iran that currently we're in a 2-week ceasefire, and please God it will hold. Sort of the Iranians now struggling with the fact that their homeland now is directly being attacked, and the regional proxies haven't worked. And one of the aspirations of the Americans and the Israelis is to say that Iran can't function with a proxy network across the region anymore. And that, this is no longer how the Middle East can operate. Because if it does, that is the recipe for endless war. Because if you've got spaces where proxies are operating, which is supposed to be either in sovereign Syria or Lebanon or in the West Bank or in Gaza, you're not really negotiating with the leadership there, because you've got a separate armed entity that doesn't respect one rule, one gun. And if you don't have that, then they're not really in charge. And you're seeing this really most at play in Lebanon today, where the Lebanese president and prime minister are demanding that Hezbollah don't get to dictate terms. And Iran is basically saying, no, Hezbollah basically can continue attacking, or they need to be part of the ceasefire. The Lebanese, the Iranians don't get to say if we're in a ceasefire or not. We do, because we're the official government of Lebanon. And so this is a great example of where you've got a proxy being run by another country who's trying to dictate terms there. And the Lebanese are trying right now, I think tomorrow, having a meeting in DC where, for the first time since 1948, you're going to have direct talks between the Lebanese government and the Israeli government. And that's a good thing if it can get to an actual ceasefire.
Well, let's use that to segue into Iran, Joel, because that's where a lot of the world's attention is now. What you just touched on some of this, but let me ask you in a different way. What concerns you the most about the short and the long-term implications of this war?
So let's try and understand, despite the tons of different contradictory messages, what was this war about? So It seemed to me, at least when you read between the lines, the aim was to try and stop the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon. It was to try and stop their ballistic missile program, and it was to try and stop the regional proxies. Iran, the problem of Iran and the US has been going on since the revolution in 79. And sort of it's been a 40-year sort of complete break between the US and the Iranians. And the worry that came up in the early 2000s was that the Iranians were trying to enrich uranium so that if they got a nuclear weapon, they could threaten the world. Now, some people believe that the Iranians are completely irrational and that they're run by a religious radical ayatollahs and that they would use a nuclear weapon if they got one. Others think that they want a nuclear weapon in order to, much like with North Korea, become unassailable and just become a regional fact, and that they could threaten the region even if they weren't going to blow up the region. Either way, the other regional powers and US allies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, they can't have Iran get a nuclear weapon, because if Iran did get a nuclear weapon, they would want to have a nuclear weapon because they would need to kind of balance the powers out. So it would completely destroy the non-proliferation treaty that's really been keeping the amount of nuclear weapon states as low as possible. So President Obama tried with the JCPOA, which was a diplomatic arrangement. The critics of the JCPOA, a lot of regional actors, basically said the Iranians are lying to you, that in 2031, when it ran out, they'd have trillions of dollars, they'd be able to enrich uranium again, and they'd have all these ballistic missiles. So President Trump, in his first time, tore it up, went to like a maximum pressure campaign, but ultimately all of this failed, right? Because the Iranians were running towards a bomb. And so last June, the Israelis and the Americans bombed the major nuclear sites, but the Iranians still had enough for 11 bombs, according to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, in highly enriched uranium. And so the Americans and the Israelis felt that the only way to prevent them from moving that into a nuclear bomb was to basically through war and kinetic action. And so that was the aim of what was going on. So that's what the purpose, at least it seems, of the war was.
You didn't mention regime change, Joel. I'm guessing that might have been on purpose.
So, how do you ultimately prevent them from going back to doing all of this? Is that in many ways, people think you need a different government, right? So the Israelis, at least from the New York Times, seemingly said to President Trump that there would be regime change, that the regime was on the verge of breaking. In January, we had these huge protests that the Iranians mowed down 40,000 of their own people to prevent them from uprising. And the aim was that if you weaken the state so much that the people will rise up and take over. But there was an Israeli politician called Aryeh Deri, who's a religious politician, and there's a Jewish stew that you make over Shabbat called cholent, where you chuck a whole bunch of beans and meat in there. Why am I telling you this story? When asked, like, why, are you satisfied with the results of the war? Aryeh Deri said, war is like cholent. You know what you throw in, but you don't know what you get out. So the Israelis promised that there would be regime change, but there hasn't been. And the US, learning from Iraq, and what happened there is that we don't want to be rebuilding nations. When you collapse regimes, we don't want to, the Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you own it. We don't want to be in that space. And so if the regime collapses, great, but that's not what we're going to define as our success. So there was 6 weeks of war, gas prices blew up, and the Iranians successfully managed to sort of stop the passage of ships through the Straits of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil goes through. And then very quickly, given the rising prices here and across US allies like the Republic of Korea, all across Asia and Europe, President Trump decided to have this 2-week ceasefire, see if they could now come to a deal that would prevent Iran from having that highly enriched uranium, would limit their proxies, and would allow the Straits of Hormuz to reopen. Vice President J.D. Vance did marathon talks for 21 hours, and though they had good agreements, they didn't come to an agreement overall. And so right now, the U.S. has a naval blockade of the Iranians to try and prevent them from blocking the Straits of Hormuz. And that's where we are sort of deadlocked. And the question is, will it go back to war? Will it not go back to war? And if it does go back to war, can military pressure still achieve the getting rid of the uranium and everything else? And it's very unclear if it can. And so in many ways, the US is stuck in the situation that if it bombs more, it could create all of those economic problems, but it might not get the outcome that it wants.
It seems like regime change was like option or objective, D or E or maybe even F on the list of reasons why this is happening. And it seems like if there were one thing, Joel, that the world could have gotten behind, it's that. removing the Islamic Republic, weakening its proxies, and giving the Iranian people more autonomy and control over their lives.
I think it's an incredibly noble aim. I think it's very difficult to know how to do that. In many ways, the Iranian people have to be able to sort of do it themselves. And so when President Trump said help was on the way after January, the question is like, how do you do that? I think, can you create regime change through air bombing? I don't think we've ever seen it before. And so even if you went on the ground, would people welcome you as liberators or as conquerors? We've heard all of these things before. I think that the American people are incredibly skeptical. There was seemingly a plan to sort of arm the Iranian opposition through the Kurds. That didn't seem to have worked. And I think one of the challenges is when you hit massive infrastructure that is not regional infrastructure, it's country infrastructure. If you blow up every power plant in a country, it's not really like the people are going to thank you for it. It's where they're going to find the money for it. If you blow up an oil depot and you've got literal black rain falling on the entire population of Tehran that's poisoning the waters, people aren't going to thank you for it. So it's a very difficult military objective to win over those hearts and minds. And it's something we talked a lot about in Iraq. I would say that it's been very difficult for this administration and the Israeli government to be able to project this sort of hearts and mind strategy to the people of Iran. There was an attempt, but as this went on and there were more and more, key assets of the Iranian people hit, it becomes harder and harder. Like when the public health institute, the Louis Pasteur, is hit, which is a huge public health institute, you could claim it's dual use. I'm not talking about the legality of it, but from just the individual on the street, look at these national symbols of pride being blown up. It doesn't really ingratiate you to those who are blowing them up.
Right. And it appears at this point anyway, the Islamic Republic is not only not weakened necessarily, but any closer to collapse. And as that New York Times article you referenced a minute ago said, the U.S. military officials on the way in called that part of it anyway farcical. Do you agree?
I think that it's very difficult to predict what happens during a war. I would defer to our own intelligence services, and if they think it's farcical, I would probably tend to agree. But it's not right to say that the Iranians haven't been weakened. They've been massively weakened. Their navy's gone. Massive parts of their economy have been demolished. There's complete air dominance over Iran. They've been revealed to be a paper tiger. But Joe, there are two outcomes that the region can't have. And I think that as President Trump looks at this is what he's struggling with. You can't have an Iran that breaks into sort of constituent parts, like a failed state. A failed state of Iran is a nightmare. You'd have a refugee crisis. You'd have armed militias. What would happen with that highly enriched uranium? It's just a complete nightmare for the region. And you can't have an Iran that feels like it won this round. Because if they feel like they've won this round, they're going to take it out on the people closest to them, which is the Gulf states around them, and they don't want to feel abandoned by the US that the job was half finished. So how do you get out of that? Like, what is the solution? What is the regional compact that makes the region safer after you've done this operation than it was before? So yes, you need to have the Straits of Hormuz open, but you need to have some sort of agreement with the Iranians where you've got the limit on the uranium, you've got an agreement regionally. But you've got this, the competing interest is this: to get an agreement with the Iranians, that will strengthen the state of the Islamic Republic. And yet, if you don't have one and you weaken the Islamic Republic, you also make sure that there's no ability to have a deal, which is what you need. So you've got this push and pull that if you can't collapse the regime, and there's no guarantee you can collapse the regime, you need to strengthen it in order for there to be able to be a deal. But that also strengthens the very thing you don't want. And this is a contradiction, and why a lot of people were very skeptical that using kinetic activity was going to get you the result that you wanted.
Well, there's a lot of talk about President Trump's exit ramp and his search for it. Who do you think stands to benefit the most in this region, depending on the outcome?
Well, there could be real winners and real losers. If the Iranians basically come out with them feeling like they've won, and that they've still got some ability to sort of power project and have a better relationship with the Americans afterwards, while they would have suffered massive tactical losses, they would have survived a superpower and their main regional opponent, Israel, from attacking them. If they don't get that and they're weakened, then they're shown that they've actually lost, because this naval blockade sort of demonstrates that there's a way that you can keep the global economy going while also weakening the regime. Then the Israelis really have won, because they've demonstrated they've taken out not only their biggest opponent, but they've taken out the proxies around them. And in many ways, does the future of Lebanon go through Tehran or does it go through Beirut? Right? If the Iranians get to dictate what happens in Lebanon, they've strengthened the relationship between them and their proxies. If they don't get to dictate what happens in Lebanon, and instead there's a peace deal that happens in Washington, completely separate from what's happening in Tehran, then in many ways you've broken that link. And that's a big win for Israel and the US in terms of breaking that link. So there are multiple pieces of this puzzle. And yet, Joe, if you asked everyone in the region what's the number one thing that has to come out of this, and also President Trump's number one thing, the Iranians cannot hold on to that highly enriched uranium, and they can't have an ability to enrich uranium. And how you can get there is very difficult, because for the Iranians, if they give up the uranium, they need something else to guarantee the security of their regime. And for them, if they give that up, they're going to want the Straits of Hormuz instead to be that thing. But if you give up the Straits of Hormuz, you've given up the concept that there's freedom of navigation everywhere. And that's a global issue as well. So how you deal with this is very complicated. And what are the guarantees the Iranians have that if they do give up the uranium, they're not going to suddenly be attacked again without the threat that they could build a nuclear bomb? And that's the diplomatic problem that everyone's trying to solve.
But the idea of there being the possibility of true and real change in Iran, and by that I mean a change toward democratization, you say is what? Unlikely?
I think that you now have more hardliners running Iran after taking out the supreme leader. His son's more hardline, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, are now more extreme. But the regime, of course, is weakened, right? And economically, it's going to be bad. I think that if you asked the region before the war started, they would say that after the January protests, that the extreme sanctions that the Americans were doing and others was working, and that could have caused regime collapse. Post the war, I think that it's too early to tell. I think that there are definitely weaknesses in the regime, but you've replaced the more moderate elements with more hardline elements. The concept that you're going to have a Jeffersonian democracy to sweep up Iran, I think is fanciful. But the concept that you could have change by some elements within the Iranian society sort of trying to overcome some of the supreme leader and the IRGC, I think could have been possible. But now with the new leadership, I'm just not enough of an expert on internal Iranian dynamics to be able to tell you whether that's less likely. But the experts who are out there think it's probably less likely now than it was before.
I know folks like you are not big on what ifs, but do you think it would have mattered had President Trump put together some sort of a larger, more cohesive coalition going into this rather than just going into it alone with Israel?
I think it would have created a longer ramp to be able to do military activity. I think that the rest of the GCC was kind of surprised. I think everyone was surprised. And if you read the New York Times piece, it seems like the window to start this operation happened quicker because they had this, what they said, golden intelligence, that the supreme leader was meeting with his top echelon of generals. And so they had to kick it off then because it was a golden opportunity, which was a successful decapitation strike of sort of their senior leadership. I think that if you had got regional buy-in, and I would say actually, Joe, most importantly, if we had US buy-in, if we had made the argument, if President Trump had made the argument to the American people why this needed to happen, just, there are lots and lots of lessons from the war in Iraq, but one at least successful thing is there was at least a congressional vote. There was a vote that we were going to give the authorization of military force to the president before they did that. Now, people regret that vote, but the people's representatives had a chance to vote. I think that doing such a major military operation, absence of a congressional vote, it breaks our system. Now, you could say, well, he wasn't going to win the vote. Then you shouldn't do it. If you can't convince the people's representatives to do it, then you shouldn't do it. And I think that, our population is very understandably war-weary and very war-weary about doing another regime change operation in the Middle East. And why should we be doing such things? And, President Trump should have made the argument. I'm not saying that, therefore, it would have been right to do it if he had have won the vote. But if there was a clear strategy in-ramp and off-ramp, or if he had it just as a negotiation tactic to demonstrate that he had the full support of his population, it could have changed Iranian thinking. If the Iranians knew that there was an authorization of use of military force, they could have taken the threat even more credibly and maybe have come to the table without the need to have actually have done this. Who knows? That's sort of a what if.
There have been so many reports about this meeting that we've been talking about, reportedly between Trump and Netanyahu. I get the impression, and again, this is just anecdotal, I don't know, but I get the impression that Israel and the U.S. thought this would be, for lack of, I guess, a more complicated term, short, fairly simple, and successful. Do you, first of all, agree with that, and do you think that was a miscalculation?
I think that was the assumption, but I think that what does short look like for each country is a different thing. Israel's basically the Israeli population. In America we've seen this through price increase. In Israel, there's been rockets and missiles falling on their head, and people have been living in bomb shelters for over 40 days. So their population, though, are very upset with the ceasefire because they were like, what was it all for? Right. If at the end of the day, the threat still exists there. So I think that for the Israelis, what does short mean? I think it was a bit longer than sort of this thing. I think for the Americans, they saw the 60 days, which is part of the War Powers Act, as their sort of thing. I would say that the Israeli miscalculation is that either that they assumed that this would be over very quickly and regime change would happen very suddenly, which I would say would be a very bad plan, or that they really misunderstood the level of patience that President Trump would have had for this. Now, I don't think, again, no one knows anything, right? So these are all just guesses based off some level of hope and knowledge and everything else. I don't think we're going to go back to the same intensity of war as we had before the ceasefire. I could be completely wrong. President Trump could go back to decide to continue the bombing. But I think that there are going to be even stronger questions asked by his own party as well as others. Like, what will change if you go back to bombing now than if you didn't go back to bombing before? Like, if you couldn't achieve it before, why do it now? I think that for the Israelis, the aim is to lock in as much as you've done now as physically possible, and then deal with the fact that you've set back Iran by X amount of years, whatever that might be. But I think that the nerve-wracking thing is that you've got this highly enriched uranium that's under the ground. And what's going to happen? And there's talks about an intelligence ring, trying to constantly monitor it. I don't know, in many ways, this might push the Iranians to run towards a bomb even quicker to try and do it because they've seen what's happened if they don't have one. So these are all very deeply worrying things. And I think that, what was the assumption? I think that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been looking to try and get rid of the Iranian nuclear threat since 2006, I think saw his opportunity, even though I think he knew that this would even further lose Israeli support amongst the American electorate. And I think he was well aware of that this would go even worse, that it was worth the risk, and that all this political credit that he had built up was worth expending on this. But if at the end it's not successful, the question is, was the bet worth it? Because if Iran still has the potential to get a nuclear weapon and Israel's popularity in the US has gone to historic lows, then who really won the strategic bet? And I think that's something that Jerusalem is struggling with. And, there's going to be elections in Israel in October. Yeah. Prime Minister Netanyahu's biggest opponent at the moment in the polls is the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And he's tweeting about Israel standing in the US as a national security threat. And so this is going to be now an electoral question about what happened, even if we supported the war, was it worth it given what it cost the Israelis and its strategic standing in the US?
Let's talk just briefly about the election in Hungary, because it does dovetail into what you just mentioned there. Prime Minister Viktor Orban, an ally of President Trump, just lost after 16 years of rule. By all accounts, it was a stunning defeat. What does that portend for the upcoming Israeli elections, do you think? Because as I understand, I think I read somewhere that Orban and Netanyahu used the same pollster?
They did. And so one of Netanyahu's most friendly journalists, Amit Segal, pointed out that, Orban's pollster was wrong by 20%. And if he's wrong by, 20% in the Israeli elections, it's doom bells for Netanyahu. There's a lot of similar analogies, but one very big critical difference. So I'll go through the analogies first. Viktor Orban and Prime Minister Netanyahu were very close, both ideologically and sort of, in many ways, Orban represented a version of what we call competitive autocracy, where there's still elections, but you try and move some of the edges around the media and around other things to try and make it basically a more crony type situation. And there are many things that have been going on in Israel recently that have been moving to sort of weaken the judiciary, weaken the media environment in a very similar way. And in many ways, that's also similar to President Trump and the Trump second administration, that's why they were so popular there. If you look at the person who won in Hungary, Peter Magos, he came from Orban's party. Like, this isn't like some left-wing person. He's also center-right, but it was against the corruption and it was against all these different things, and saying we can have a better relationship with Europe and we can be anti-Russian while also maintaining a strong anti-immigrant perspective and a very proud Hungarian first perspective. And that won 2/3. Now, you could see a very clear analogy to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's also been there for a long time. His opponent, Naftali Bennett, also used to be part of the Likud and then left and started his own party. So there are many similarities, but there's one big difference. Viktor Orban, to have these massive majorities that he needed to change the Hungarian constitution, changed the electoral system in terms of how they did the election. And so even though he would win just over 55% of the vote, he'd have, 2/3 majority of the parliament. So now that the shoe was on the other foot, even though his opponent won 53% of the vote, they've got over 2/3 of the parliament. And so now they can undo everything he did. Israel hasn't changed its electoral system. It's still a single parliamentary list that's one national constituency, which means that even should the election go against Netanyahu, he won't lose in such a way that Viktor Orban lost. And so he still maintains hope that he could be part of a coalition or block the coalition of the opposition.
All right, back to big picture, and then I want to move on to some of the Israeli-Palestinian issues that you have dealt with personally. But what, in your opinion, is the main thing, or maybe a critical thing, people misunderstand when it comes to trying to forge a plan to peace in the Middle East?
I think there are a few things. I think one, lots of people think it's just about land and not about narrative. And narrative is very important to people. And a corollary to that is many people in Israel and amongst the Palestinians, international law is not the first thing they think about. They think about religious law, they think about other things in that regards, and how that how religion informs that construct is very important. And a credit that I'll give President Trump is the 18th point 18 in his 20-point Gaza plan spoke about interfaith dialogue. It's not really about interfaith dialogue. It's about taking seriously the faith commitments that religious people in the region have when we think about peace. I think that a lot of people just dismiss it as either just a huge negative or an irrelevant factor. And in many ways, it needs to be the thing that builds the bridge rather than the thing that needs to be avoided if we're going to move forward.
That's religion, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's key. Is it also, or maybe as much, about power, land, and history?
Power, land, and history, of course, are integral. And sort of how do you, if a side is not incentivized to be able to make necessary compromises, they're never going to make such a compromise in terms of what they need to do. But at the same time, the way that, we spoke earlier about intensity of preference, the people who are most motivated to prevent a deal are often motivated by religious institution or this true belief that the other side just wants to kill them every day. And if we don't also, going back to the grassroots and the work of MEPA, this fund that I helped pass and what I did before in OLMEP, if we don't have someone thinking every day, working on the issue that the majority of each side believes that the other side wakes up every day trying to work out, why is the other trying to kill me? They wake up terrified of the other people. If we don't have someone trying to work to help settle those fears down, we're not going to get anywhere, because this isn't going to happen just by forcing one side into it or the other.
What do you think is the best chance for peace in the Middle East? We hear a lot about a two-state solution. Do you think that'll ever happen? And do you think that is part of the answer?
I think that the concept of an Oslonian solution of hermetically sealed borders between Israelis and Palestinians isn't going to happen, often for modern reasons. Today, states don't have hermetically sealed borders, especially states smaller than New Jersey. Water is a shared capital, technology, viruses, these things don't know borders. What will it be? I think you're eventually going to need to have some level of sovereign Palestinian entity that works out what its relationship is with the state of Israel from an economic perspective, from everything else. But, I also think that it's very important that post-October 7th, that the Israelis define what it is that they want. I think we're very clear on what the Israelis don't want. I think that they've been very clear about that. But what is it that they want? And I think that the next Israeli government after this election in October is going to be forced to confront that. And they're going to need to confront that to be able to say what they want to the Trump administration. They're going to need to confront that to say what they want for the region and what they want from the rest of the world. They need to say what they're for, not just what they're against. And I think that they've struggled to do that, because I think that post-October 7th, this concept of just delaying an inevitable is no longer popular.
Yeah. How much did that October 7th and the war that followed set back the hope for peace there?
Massively. I think that it reset everything down to -10. Like, imagine that you're Gazan, right? And you've just gone through this horrendous, some people say genocide, some people say, just terrible war, whatever parlance you use, right? if you're a kid in Gaza, it doesn't matter what parlance you use, right? The concept that you could ever make peace with the people on the other side just seems absurd. And if you're Israeli and you've been told and you've seen that everyone in Gaza supported what happened on October 7th, you come back, hear the stories from the hostages that no one helped them. You have this image that there are no innocents in Gaza. And that's a disgusting thing to say, by the way, right? A horrendous thing to say, but it's something that's being breached into society because there's just complete dehumanization. So how possibly can you move forward on that? You've got violent settler vigilante attacks happening in the West Bank that even the Trump administration is complaining about. We've got massive levels of intercommunal violence happening. So we're reaching a point of explosion. And so how do you de-escalate? How do you calm it down? You could see maybe a pathway forward if there's a Saudi regional integration with the Israelis, if there's a solution for a political pathway forward with the Palestinians. But I will say a sense of optimism. There are many ways you can criticize the Trump administration, but the Trump administration does have an ability to push the Israelis into places that other administrations haven't, because Trump is very popular in Israel and people are also scared about saying no to him. So if there is a chance to try and move this into a better situation, which requires strong arming the Israelis a little bit, I have more optimism about doing that while Trump is in office than I do if he's not there.
I sent you a clip the other day, and I'm sure you had seen it, but Bill Clinton was expressing regret that Yasser Arafat turned down a deal in 94, I believe it was, and Clinton was adamant that Arafat should have taken that deal. Do you agree with that? And do you think there have been missed opportunities in the past that would have come to a peaceful solution and avoided much of what we've seen and watched and heard today?
Yes. I think that the Israelis always like to say that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I would argue that the Palestinians also have a similar claim that the Israelis find an opportunity to miss opportunities. That's probably more recent than before. I think that you can listen to the actual what happened at Taba with Bill Clinton and what happened in Camp David. The Saudis famously were furious with the Palestinians and with Chairman Arafat, saying that you've destroyed the region for another generation by not accepting this. The Palestinians and Rob Malley, who was an American negotiator, said that the Americans pushed the Palestinians before they were ready, and that the Israeli offer kept moving and Barak kept moving the offer, and that it was a 3-1 landslide. There's always these details, but the reality is that the high point of what the Palestinians could have got from the Israelis was probably then. And from that point, it's just been getting lower and lower and lower. But the Palestinians' expectations haven't shifted. And so you've got this mismatch of what they hope to get versus the reality of what they possibly could get. And then how much longer can this go on? I think that it's very easy for each side to believe that time is on their side and that the other one will eventually shatter or break and give up. But they're not going to shatter, they're not going to break, and they're not going to give up. And so how you can actually come out of this is the difficulty that negotiators and mediators are trying to look at. I think that one of the things, like the Abraham Accords, is trying to say if we can get the rest of the region to accept Israel, does that open up possibilities for the Palestinians? I think that at the beginning of the Abraham Accords, it was done very much against the Palestinians, but I think there has been some smartness in Ramallah to try and say, how can we use these Abraham Accords to actually help us rather than just oppose them? I think we've really seen that on the Saudi file, where the Saudis have become very invested in the future of Ramallah, and the Palestinians are working with Saudi rather than just attacking the Crown Prince. And by doing that, hoping that Trump's relationship with MBS helps them rather than hurts them.
Our common friend, Charmaine Cruz, was on the podcast in January to talk about her native Iran. And she mentioned you in her book, Stoic Empathy. That's how I found you, actually. She wrote, when it comes to contentious issues, it's often seen as a right side and a wrong side, advocates fighting for their people. And she goes on to say, you are an Orthodox Jew and you've worked with Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim leaders. And you balance your faith without ever displaying an allegiance to either side. How do you separate emotions, Joel, while trying to facilitate these objectives?
I think that, firstly, when you're mediating, I think what people want most of all is to see that you're a useful mediator. And if you can add utility, no one really cares about your religion or anything else. I think that's firstly important. Like, the sides only trust someone if you're useful to them and you add utility and they can trust you. I think it can be very hard to separate one's emotions, but I also feel a real sense of privilege that I have an ability to at least try and make a difference. But in order to do that, sometimes you need to, put aside your own emotions. I often joke, I don't get to meet nice people. I only get to meet people who have terrible human rights records or who are autocrats or who have done horrible things. because those are the people often at war with each other or who are in conflict with each other. And once you realize that, it's not about making you the story or putting yourself in the middle of it, but rather trying to help others deal with their own problems, it becomes easier to sort of separate your own emotions from that. But I have a wonderful, supportive wife. And honestly, and this might sound funny, but it's not. Being an obsessive Bears fan has helped because I can put my emotional frustration on the hopes and dreams of 24 to 35-year-olds rather than sort of my main conflicting. But genuinely, Joe, that's something that really happens. I spend time at my local dive bar, Monsignor Murphy's here in Lakeview, and that helps me deal with some of the stresses of my job by being able to just channel it into something else and then try and come objectively to that. So having an ability to displace these emotions into a safe space is, I think, very important.
Best case scenario, you have to be hopeful in your position, Joel. That's critical, obviously. If you and I were having this conversation again 10 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, where do you think we are?
The hopeful scenario is that we have a more regional and a more integrated region. You've got the Palestinians have got a measure of freedom, rights, and dignity that have occurred within some symbiotic relationship with the state of Israel. You've got regional integration where you've got regional relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the whole Muslim world, and that you've got a balance of power in the region between the various different actors that they've worked out how to solve regional problems together. You'll have some joint infrastructure like the India-Middle East corridor that supplies oil and gas, and some pipeways and railways, if we're going to be real optimistic, between Damascus and Tel Aviv and Beirut and stretching all the way to Riyadh, that you've actually got intercommunal rail, pipelines and other things. That's the hope of where we hope to get to. If that's the ceiling, the floor is sort of just endless conflict. And so where do we get to? My hope is somewhere in between there, where, my hope is the ceiling. The realism is that we need to push towards that vision and in a real sense. And what I mean by that is it's very easy after body blow after body blow to think that it's pointless and hopeless. But for the people of the region, the sun rises every day and the sun sets every day. And every day we're trying to move things closer to a scenario where we're getting towards the ceiling, or are we just giving up and allowing the radicals to push us towards the floor? And it requires of all of us an ability to push in the correct direction and to allow our intensity of preference to grow while being accountable to the people in the region. I think that we can sometimes become so obsessed about what we think should happen rather than listen to people on the ground to say, what is it that we can do to help you?
Wow, that's very well put. Last question, Joel. Bears, Arlington Heights, or are they going to Indiana?
Well, let's see if the State House can get it together. I hope Arlington Heights, mainly because we shouldn't change the fight song. But honestly, I'm more concerned about making sure we've got a good left tackle next year so that Caleb can become the MVP rather than where we're going to play.
Yeah. Listen, Joel, this has been fascinating. I appreciate the time. This has been going on, obviously, for decades. There are no easy answers or it wouldn't still be an issue. So I thank you for educating us, for, again, your time, your dedication, and your commitment to truly trying to make a difference for a better world.
Thanks so much, Joe, for having me.
My thanks to Brian Griggs from Brian Griggs Productions as our audio engineer. I asked a few friends to help me out on the project. Chicago vibraphonist Thaddeus Tukes created the original theme music, and Bill Curtis lends his legendary voice to the introduction each episode. I'm Joe Donlin. I'll see you on CBS News Chicago. It's available everywhere on the CBS News app. And as always, I thank you for listening to Chicago Unscripted.